On the evening of October 31st, 1974, a 34-year-old physicist from Vicenza, Italy walked out of Intel's headquarters in Santa Clara, California for the last time. His name was Federico Faggin. He had designed the world's first commercial microprocessor, the Intel 4004. He had conceived and supervised the architecture of the 8080, the chip that would launch the personal computer industry. Intel's leadership, Andy Grove, Robert Noyce, and Gordon Moore, had decreed that his name be mentioned as little as possible in the company's own history. Now he was leaving, and he was taking an idea with him. Not a document, not a blueprint. Just the knowledge of what a microprocessor could be if someone built a company that believed the microprocessor was the product, not just a way to sell more memory chips. Faggin had no office, no funding, and no employees. What he had was a 40-pin ceramic chip design forming in his mind, a package small enough to hold between two fingers and capable of changing what a computer was, who could own one, and what it would cost. That chip would become the Zilog Z80, and the company Faggin built to make, it would grow from a rented desk on State Street in downtown Los Altos to over 1,000 employees in 2 years. But the story of what happened to Zilog after the Z80 conquered the world is stranger than the founding. And it begins with an oil company. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. Federico Faggin did not come to Silicon Valley by accident. Born in 1941 in northeastern Italy, he studied physics at the University of Padua, graduating summa cum laude in 1965. His first job was at SGS Fairchild in Italy, where he developed their earliest MOS process technology and designed their first integrated circuits. By 26 years old, he had already built things that most engineers never attempt. In 1968, he moved to Palo Alto to join Fairchild Semiconductor's research laboratory. There, Faggin did something that would quietly shape the next half-century of electronics. He developed the original MOS silicon gate technology, the manufacturing process that made modern CMOS integrated circuits possible. Every chip in every phone, every laptop, every server today descends from that process. He also designed the Fairchild 3708, the world's first commercial integrated circuit built using silicon gate technology. 2 years later, Intel hired him. The company was young, primarily a memory chip maker, and Faggin was given a project that Intel's own leadership considered a side bet. A Japanese calculator company called Bizicom had contracted Intel to build a set of custom chips for a new line of calculators. What arrived was supposed to be a calculator engine. What Faggin built was the Intel 4004, a 4-bit microprocessor containing 2,300 transistors on a single die, the first general-purpose processor ever placed on one chip. He then led the architecture of the Intel 8080, an 8-bit processor that arrived in early 1974 and would become the engine of the Altair 8800, the machine that gave hobbyists their first real computer. But Intel in 1974 did not see microprocessors the way Faggin did. To Intel's leadership, the microprocessor was a peripheral product, a way to sell more of the company's real business, static RAM and ROM. A reorganization that year pushed the microprocessor division further from the center of the company. The 1973 to 1975 recession hit. Layoffs followed, and Faggin, the man who had designed Intel's most consequential products, found himself reporting through layers of management that did not share his conviction. The microprocessor, he believed, was the future of the entire industry. Intel treated it as an accessory to memory sales. Years later, Faggin would describe a deeper wound. He said that Intel's top management, Grove, Noyce, and Moore, had issued what amounted to a directive that his contributions be minimized in the company's public history. The man who had designed the 4004 and the 8080, the two chips that launched the microprocessor era, felt deliberately erased by the company that profited from his work. He decided he would build the company Intel refused to become. Fagin's last act at Intel was a conversation over drinks with Ralph Ungerman, one of the managers who had reported to him and who had taken over Intel's microprocessor business earlier that year. Ungerman was a Utah native, born in Provo, who had changed his career from law to engineering after watching the launch of Sputnik. He had worked at Intel on custom integrated circuit design and understood both the technology and the market. Fagin asked a simple question. "Ralph, how about starting a company, a microprocessor company, you and I?" Ungerman said yes immediately, without hesitation. Years later, Ungerman recalled the moment with the simplicity it deserved. Fagin asked, he said yes, and that was it. And that was the founding of Zilog. The next morning, November 1st, 1974, Fagin walked into a rented office on State Street in downtown Los Altos. There was no lab, no fabrication equipment, no product. There was a desk and an idea. The name came later. Intel was short for Integrated Electronics. Fagin wanted the same construction. He proposed iLog for integrated logic. When he said it aloud, Ungerman heard Zilog. Fagin laughed. Zilog. The last word in integrated logic. The timing was brutal. The total pool of venture capital available in the entire United States in 1975 was $10 million for the whole industry. The recession had frozen nearly every funding source in Silicon Valley. But before Fagin and Ungerman had even chosen a name, the industry newsletter Electronic News heard about the two former Intel engineers and published a small story. That story caught the eye of Exxon Enterprises, the technology investment arm of the oil giant Exxon Corporation, then one of the most valuable companies on Earth. Someone from Exxon called Fagin. He told them the company was not ready, that they had not decided what they were going to do. They called again. By June 1975, Exxon had written a check for $500,000, and Zilog had the money to build its first chip. In February 1975, Fagin hired the one person he knew could turn his architecture into working silicon. Masatoshi Shima was a Japanese engineer born in Shizuoka in 1943, who had studied organic chemistry at Tohoku University, switched careers to digital logic design at a calculator company called Busicom, and then followed the Intel 4004 project from Tokyo to Santa Clara. Shima had been the principal logic and transistor-level designer of both the 4004 and the 8080, working under Fagin's supervision at Intel. He was the builder behind the credited names. He understood how to take an instruction set and render it into gates, into transistors, into physical geometry on a silicon die. Now he joined Zilog as employee number 3, and the entire company had 11 people. That is not a simplification. 11. Fagin had conceived the idea for the Z80 in December 1974. Between December and February, he assembled the architecture and wrote the business plan. Shima arrived and immediately began the detailed design, drawing on his experience with NEC minicomputers to add concepts of his own. He proposed 2 complete sets of processor registers that could be swapped instantly for fast interrupt handling, a feature that made the Z80 dramatically more efficient at real-time tasks than the 8080. For the next 13 months, Fagin, Shima, and the rest of the 11-person team worked 80-hour weeks in the Los Altos office. Fagin, the CEO, spent his nights hunched over layout tables, drawing transistor-level circuits by hand alongside 2 dedicated layout engineers. By the end of the project, the precision work had damaged his eyesight permanently. He needed glasses for the first time in his life. He was building the company, running the business, and physically laying out the chip all at once. The stress was more than metaphorical. Fagin was hospitalized during this period with a perforated pyloric valve, his stomach eaten through by the pace. Colleagues arrived at his hospital room the day after surgery to discuss matters of urgency. The team ate lunch together at the Safeway down the street from their office on State Street. Shima bought canned mackerel. Fagin bought camembert. The work was relentless, collegial, and utterly consumed them. In November 1975, the completed design went to Mostek for mask making and wafer processing. 4 months later, on March 9, 1976, the first working silicon arrived. The Z80 had 2 bugs. Shima later recalled that the entire project, from kickoff to fully working silicon, had taken 1 year and 1 month. That timeline, for a chip that would sell over 1 billion units, was achieved by 11 people who stayed 11 people until January of 1976, when the first test silicon came back almost working, and Fagan finally decided to hire a 12th. That 12th hire was Bernard Puto, a computer architect brought in to begin defining the next generation processor. The Z80 was already behind them. They were already thinking about what came next. The development cost for the working prototypes was roughly $400,000 against the $500,000 Exxon had initially invested. Zilog had built its first product, a chip that would define an era, for less than the cost of a house in Palo Alto. The decision that defined the Z80 was not a feature, it was a constraint. Fagan made the Z80 binary compatible with the Intel 8080. Every program written for the 8080, including the CP/M operating system and Intel's own PLM compiler, would run unmodified on the Z80. This was not an obvious choice. Building a clean sheet processor would have been simpler and arguably more elegant. But Fagan understood something about the emerging microprocessor market that Intel's own leadership had missed. The value was not in the chip alone. The value was in the software that already existed for the chip. CP/M, created by Gary Kildall, was becoming the standard operating system for small business computers. Thousands of programs had already been written for the 8080 instruction set. By making the Z80 compatible, Fagan gave every 8080 customer a reason to switch and no reason to stay. But the Z80 was not merely compatible. It was better in ways that mattered to the people who actually designed circuit boards and built systems. The 8080 required 3 separate voltage supplies, plus 5 volts, plus 12 volts, and minus 5 volts. The Z80 ran on a single 5-volt supply. That single change cut the cost and complexity of every system the chip sat inside. The Z80 also included an on-die DRAM refresh counter, a small piece of logic that automatically handled the periodic refresh cycles that dynamic RAM required to hold its data. Without it, system designers had to build a separate refresh circuit on the motherboard. With it, they could eliminate components, reduce board size, and cut manufacturing cost. Every part removed from a circuit board was money saved, and in the home computer market, where margins were counted in single dollars, those savings made the difference between a product that shipped and one that never left the prototype stage. The Z80 also doubled the register set, added 2 index registers called NAIKI and IY, expanded the instruction set from the 8080's 78 instructions to 158 types across 694 opcodes, and packed 8,500 transistors onto a 4-micron process die. The first Z80 chips went on sale in July 1976. The initial price was $200 per unit. Within months, Zilog dropped the price to $25 and then kept cutting. Intel's 8080 had launched at $360 2 years earlier. The Z80 was faster, simpler to design around, and radically cheaper. The Z80 arrived at the exact moment the forces of history needed it. The recession of 1973 to 1975 had hollowed out venture capital and slowed the semiconductor industry. But it had also done something the established chip makers failed to notice. It had created a generation of engineers and hobbyists who wanted computing power, but could not afford the mini computers that dominated business. The Altair 8800, launched in January 1975 as a kit for $395, had proved that a market existed for personal machines. But the Altair was a hobbyist device, sold by mail order, assembled with a soldering iron. The real question was whether someone could build a computer cheap enough, simple enough, and complete enough for an ordinary consumer to buy off a shelf and use at home. The answer required a processor that was inexpensive, that ran on a simple power supply, that had an existing software base, and that did not require a board full of support chips to function. The Z80 met every requirement. Intel, meanwhile, was still treating the microprocessor as a secondary product line. Intel's revenue in 1976 came overwhelmingly from memory chips. The 8080 was a success, but Intel did not yet understand that the microprocessor, not memory, would define the company's next 4 decades. Zilog understood it from the first day of its existence, because Zilog had been founded on exactly that conviction. It was the first company in the world solely dedicated to microprocessors. With the revenue from the Z80, Zilog built its own fabrication facility. Fagan hired Len Perham from AMD as vice president of manufacturing and commissioned a 25,000 square foot production facility from Carl Berg. The company leased additional office space in Los Altos and then a building in Sunnyvale as it outgrew each location in succession. From 11 employees to over 1,000 in 2 years. The first chips from Zilog's own fab came out in January 1977, ending the company's dependence on outside foundry services. Exxon, delighted, invested more heavily. Within a few years, Zilog was generating $50 million in annual sales. The Z80 was selling tens of millions of units per year. Second-source manufacturers, including Mostec, Synertec, SGS, NEC, Sharp, Toshiba, Goldstar, Hitachi, and National Semiconductor, licensed the design or produced compatible versions. By the early 1980s, the Z80 was the most commonly used microprocessor in the world. The machines that carried the Z80 into the lives of ordinary people are some of the most consequential devices in the history of computing, and each one deserves its name, spoken aloud. In August 1977, Tandy Corporation launched the TRS-80 through its Radio Shack stores. The name itself was a tribute. Tandy Radio Shack Z80. Priced at $599, it was one of the first mass-produced, mass-marketed home computers, sold alongside batteries and transistor radios in shopping malls across America. The TRS-80 ran a Z80 clocked at 1.774 MHz, paired with 4 kilobytes of RAM and a 12-inch monochrome monitor. More than 100,000 units sold in the first 2 years. Over the full production run of the TRS-80 line, Tandy moved 2.4 million machines. Across the Atlantic, a British inventor named Clive Sinclair built something even more radical. In January 1980, Sinclair Research launched the ZX80, a home computer priced at £99 and 95 pence. It used an NEC clone of the Z80, running at 3.25 MHz. Paired with a single kilobyte of RAM, 100,000 units sold. The ZX81 followed in 1981 at £49 95, selling more than 1.5 million. Then, in April 1982, the ZX Spectrum arrived, and the Z80 became the heartbeat of an entire generation's first encounter with computing. In living rooms across Britain and Europe, children loaded games from cassette tapes, typed basic programs, and stared at color graphics rendered by a chip designed in a rented office in Los Altos 6 years earlier. The Spectrum sold more than 5 million units across its lifetime. Amstrad followed with the CPC 464, CPC 6064, and CPC 6128, all powered by the Z80. The MSX standard, backed by Microsoft and ASCII Corporation, and adopted by Sony, Panasonic, Philips, and dozens of manufacturers across Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, and Brazil, put the Z80 into millions more homes. In the arcade, the Z80 ran the original Pac-Man cabinet, the machine that earned more than $1 billion in quarters within a year of its 1980 release. Galaga ran on the Z80. Donkey Kong ran on the Z80. SNK built an arcade board using 3 Z80 processors running in tandem, 2 for the main CPU and 1 dedicated to sound, producing games with audio and visual fidelity that surpassed anything else in the arcade. When Sega built its Master System console, the Z80 was the main processor. When Nintendo designed the Game Boy in 1989, it used a Sharp LR35902, a custom chip built around the Z80's core architecture. More than 118 million Game Boys sold worldwide. Texas Instruments chose the Z80 for its TI-81 graphing calculator in 1990, and every generation of TI graphing calculators that followed carried the same instructions set into classrooms for 3 decades. An entire generation of students learned low-level programming by writing Z80 assembly on their calculators, unaware that the chip behind the screen was older than their parents' careers. Beyond computing and gaming, the Z80 found its way into places most people would never guess. The Roland Jupiter 8, one of the most celebrated analog synthesizers ever made, used a Z80 to manage its patch storage and keyboard scanning. Military systems across NATO relied on the Z80 for its predictability and proven reliability, qualities that mattered far more to defense engineers than raw performance. The Osborne 1, released in 1981 and widely considered the first commercially successful portable computer, ran on a Z80 at 4 MHz with 64 kilobytes of RAM and 2 floppy disk drives, all packed into a 24.5-pound case that technically qualified as luggable. The K-Pro 2 followed the same formula. Both ran Gary Kildall's CP/M, and both owed their existence to a chip designed in a rented office in Los Altos. The Z80 was not merely popular, it was the physical infrastructure on which the home computer age was built. But even as these machines were conquering living rooms and classrooms and arcades around the world, the company that made the chip possible was already losing the only war that mattered. In 1979, Zilog introduced the Z8000, its 16-bit successor. The Z8000 was, by most technical measures, a capable design, and it embodied features that would later become standard in processor architecture. But it had one fatal flaw, and Fagin's critics would say it was the one mistake he should have known never to make. The Z8000 was not backward compatible with the Z80. Every program, every operating system, every tool that ran on the Z80 had to be rewritten from scratch. Fagin had built the Z80's dominance on compatibility with the 8080. With the Z8000, Zilog abandoned the exact strategy that had made it dominant. The software base, the moat, was gone. Meanwhile, Intel had released the 8086 in 1978, a 16-bit processor that maintained enough architectural continuity with the 8080 to preserve the migration path for developers and customers. Motorola launched the 68000 in 1979, which, while also incompatible with prior architectures, offered a clean and capable architecture that attracted workstation makers like Apple, Amiga, and Atari. The Z8000 found itself stranded between them, competing on both fronts with neither the compatibility advantage of the 8086 nor the workstation prestige of the 68000. Zilog was also late. The Z8000 arrived roughly a year after the 8086 and was slow to deliver the complementary development tools and software that customers needed to adopt the chip. Exxon made the situation considerably worse. By 1980, Exxon had converted Zilog from an independent venture-backed startup into a wholly owned subsidiary. Exxon Enterprises wanted to build a diversified computing empire using Zilog's chips, competing directly with IBM. Exxon's ambitions drained engineering focus from Zilog's core microprocessor business, pushed R&D spending above 35% of revenue, and diverted the company's best people into systems and peripherals that had nothing to do with its strengths. When IBM began selecting a processor for what would become the IBM PC in 1981, Zilog was a natural candidate. But Exxon's openly combative stance toward IBM, its stated goal of becoming a computing rival, made IBM unwilling to build its platform on a chip made by an Exxon subsidiary. IBM chose Intel's 8088 instead. That decision gave birth to the x86 architecture and the Intel-dominated PC industry that followed. Fagan said it plainly years later. IBM could invest in Intel. They could not do that with Zilog because of Exxon. The company that built the chip to beat Intel's had handed its rival the contract of the century because its backer wanted to fight IBM. Federico Fagan left Zilog in 1981. The company he had founded, the one dedicated entirely to the microprocessor, was no longer his to direct. The story everyone tells is that Exxon's interference killed Zilog. The documented record is thinner, and honesty requires a flag here. Fagan himself has acknowledged that responsibility was shared, and you can read that decision two ways, and honest history holds both readings at once. What is not ambiguous is the trajectory. In May 1982, Exxon brought in Frank de Weger, a 50-year-old semiconductor veteran from Motorola, to stabilize the company. He shook up management, won an $18 million contract with the Internal Revenue Service, and convinced Commodore to adopt the Z8000 parts for its next machines. By 1986, Zilog was profitable again, running on a strategy focused on embedded applications rather than general-purpose computing. Having squeezed the subsidiary into profitability, Exxon decided to exit the technology business entirely. In 1989, Exxon sold Zilog to its own management. In a leveraged buyout backed by Warburg Pincus, led by Dr. Edgar Sack, Zilog went public in 1991. It was no longer a microprocessor company in any meaningful sense. It was a microcontroller supplier building application-specific chips around Z80 and Z8 cores for remote controls, embedded systems, and industrial equipment. In 1998, Texas Pacific Group acquired Zilog and tried to push into 32-bit data communications processors. The strategy failed. In 2001, Zilog filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It emerged in 2002, smaller and quieter. By 2007, sales had stabilized at $82 million a year, a modest number for a company whose first product had powered hundreds of millions of machines. In February 2009, Zilog sold its remote control and secured transaction businesses to Maxim Integrated and Universal Electronics for roughly $31 million. In December of that year, IQIS Corporation bought what remained of Zilog for $62.4 million in cash, approximately $3.59 per share. In 2017, Littelfuse acquired IQIS for $750 million in cash and stock, and Zilog became a line item inside a circuit protection company. Its name preserved on a product catalog of microcontrollers. The Z80, the product, outlived every version of the company that made it. It remained in continuous production for 48 years, from July 1976 until June 2024, when Littelfuse announced that its wafer foundry would no longer support the Z84CL0 family, and that last-time buy orders would close on June 14, 2024. More than 1 billion Z80 chips were sold across those 5 decades. And that number does not include the hundreds of millions of licensed clones and unlicensed copies produced by NEC, Sharp, Toshiba, and manufacturers across Eastern Europe and Russia. The chip-powered computers, consoles, arcade cabinets, calculators, military systems, medical equipment, and industrial controllers across 30 countries and 3 generations of engineers. When the end-of-life notice appeared in April 2024, a developer named Ronaldas Xioma launched a project to build a free and open-source silicon replacement, a physical chip clone fabricated on a modern 130-nanometer process through the Tiny Tape-Out community wafer service. The first working silicon has been confirmed functional. The project is now targeting a drop-in replacement in the original 40-pin DIP package, designed to slot directly into machines like the ZX Spectrum and RC 2014 kits without modification. Hobbyist communities are still building new Z80 computers in 2024 and beyond. Collectors are still trading working vintage machines. Programmers are still writing new software for an architecture designed before most of them were born. The users have delivered their verdict. The chip endures. Fagan went on to co-found Synaptics in 1986, the company that developed the touchpad technology used in virtually every laptop computer made since the 1990s. In 2010, he received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Obama, the highest honor the United States confers for technological achievement. He never returned to Zilog. That 40-pin DIP package is still here. You can hold one in your hand today. Pull it from a dead ZX Spectrum or a Radio Shack dumpster find or an old engineer's parts drawer, and you are holding a chip that was drawn by hand, transistor by a physicist from Vicenza and an engineer from Shizuoka, in a rented office above a street where they walked to Safeway for lunch. That chip powered the first computer millions of people ever touched. It ran Pac-Man, it ran CP/M. It ran the Game Boy in your pocket, and the graphing calculator on your desk, and the controller inside an elevator that carried you this morning. Federico Fagan built the chip that brought computing home, but the company he built to house it was never allowed to grow into what the chip deserved. Exxon wanted an empire. IBM chose Intel. And the Z80 conquered the world under other companies' names, inside other companies' machines, while the startup on State Street in Los Altos became a subsidiary, then a bankruptcy filing, then a line item in a circuit protection company's annual report. The chip outlived them all. If you owned a ZX Spectrum, a TRS-80, a Master System, a Game Boy, or a CPC, or if you programmed a TI graphing calculator in Z80 assembly during a maths class, or if you built something with this chip that still runs today, drop a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether it still works. The people who use these machines and the people who built them know more about what was lost than the people who sold it. We have the story of another American tech empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.